So after I'd finished this book, I just kind of sat on it for a while. I didn't really know what to do with it. But I knew that I had to go with a Christian publisher. I knew that a religiously affiliated publisher would be the only type of house that would publish it, because I talk about God so much that I knew that it would turn off any normal publisher. And so I set out to find one. And I knew that they would have a problem with, like I said in the last video, the way that theists read it and they hear atheism, and atheists read it and they hear theism, and both get turned off. So let's just say it makes it a little niche. But I managed to find a publisher that was essentially it was connected with an evangelist church. And I didn't really have that much experience with evangelicals at the time. I knew their reputation. I figured, whatever, maybe they'll go for it. And they would highlight things that they had a disagreement with. And almost all of them were exclusively when I would refer to man as an animal or to evolution. And for some reason, it's impossible for, the two sides of the argument. Were we just created whole cloth, or did we develop into what we are now? And did every species develop into what they are currently from something before? Somehow, these two ideas can't coexist. Somehow, the creator of the universe is incapable of developing a process of getting us from single cell to multicellular to complex creatures. That's beyond God's grasp. It's so easy to understand both, that the world's created and then set this mechanism, this process is set into motion that then eventually leads to mankind. I don't understand how that's so difficult to grasp, but needless to say, I ended up leaving this publisher just before publishing because we couldn't agree on this. I refused to remove any of that from my book because everything rests upon that understanding that man is an animal. So we parted ways. But I want to get into that. I want to get into how you have to understand Christianity, to understand religion, you have to understand that men are not angels. And that was these were the discussions I'd have with them. I would say to these evangelicals, I'd say, do you firmly believe that you're not an animal? That implies that you think you're an angel. But don't you have multiple children? Doesn't that mean that you banged your wife multiple times animalistically? You came inside of your wife and she was impregnated and then had painful childbirth multiple times, and yet you don't recognize that same behavior in animals? When you woke up today, did you take a piss right away? Maybe you took a dump. That's what animals do. We have the same basic instincts and faculties as creatures because we are. But the difference is the development of the intellect. And that development of the intellect brought about consciousness that we have, that animals don't. And so that separates us. That's why we are stuck in between heaven and hell, essentially. We're stuck between the jungle and the stars. If you watched my McCurdy and I series on the Universal Classic Monsters, the final episode was all about that. It was about mankind eternally stuck between the jungle and the stars. And it's a genius metaphor because that understanding leads to understanding everything about the human condition. And it starts with knowing that we're animals, but that we can choose to rise above it. And that's where Christianity enters. That's where morality enters. So this, of course, brings to mind Jiminy Cricket from Pinocchio, who is essentially a metaphor for the conscience.
And always let your conscience be your guide.
Consciousness leads to a conscience. It's no coincidence that those terms share a similar etymology. But when it comes to Pinocchio, the best part of that story, I'll just say the cartoon, because that's what I'm most familiar with, the Disney cartoon, is when Jiminy Cricket is trying to tell Pinocchio, who was born yesterday, what good and bad is. And he's struggling with it because, he's thinking to himself, well, you have to do good things. But sometimes the thing that you think is good at the time is actually bad later on. And then sometimes you have to do bad things because it's for a good that you can't see yet. And he's tripping over his words and he's struggling with it because defining good and evil is difficult. I've been reading Machiavelli's The Prince lately. Is it Machiavelli or Machiavelli? Does it matter? This caught my eye because I've been thinking about this video. He said, when it comes to princes, if everything is considered carefully, it will be found that something which looks like virtue, if followed, would be his ruin, while something else, which looks like vice, yet followed, brings him security and prosperity. So there it is right there. Sometimes it's not as simple as doing the right thing when the right thing ends up serving evil. And so the difficulty of being a person in general is you think you're being good, but are you serving evil? And so many people today serve evil without knowing it. The vast amount of evil committed is coming from people who think they're on the side of good. And that's because whatever force they're serving comes to them in the form of good. They believe they're performing good. And so Jiminy Cricket is trying to define this, and he can't find the words. And Pinocchio just, nods along, and he says, "Do you understand, Pinocchio?" And he goes, So it reflects an eternal truth that it's hard to define good and evil. So that brings us to my definition of good and evil. And if you can defeat this definition, have at it, because so far I haven't personally found anything that shoots this down. Basically, with the understanding that we are animals with a higher consciousness, with an intellect that allows us to choose good and bad, because our animality implies certain appetites. This is where the 7 deadly sins enter: gluttony, greed, sloth, envy, wrath, pride, lust. All 7 of those are clearly nothing more than animal appetites. When individuals concern themselves with just maximizing their gluttony, greed, sloth, envy, wrath, pride, lust, all of society suffers. That being the case, what is good? How do you define good? Good is simply the act of sacrificing those animal urges for the sake of everybody, the collective, society at large. Evil is sacrificing the well-being of others for one's own self. Anybody in the comments, please jump in the comments. Give me an instance where that is not true. Again, it all comes down to sacrificing your animal urges for the sake of everybody. And then again, the flip side, sacrificing others to capitalize on your gluttony, greed, sloth, envy, wrath, pride, lust. That's evil. So let's say abortion. That's an easy one. That is maybe the easiest of all of them. Is abortion good or is it evil? Well, the goodness of becoming a mother is that you had your time, you had your childhood, now you've grown into being a woman, and then you made the choice, assuming that it was a choice. Let's leave the exceptions of grape out of this. She sacrifices her body, and then past that, she sacrifices her time and energy and anxiety and all of that to the well-being of this child that hopefully someday will pay that forward, and that's how all of life persists. The flip side of that, of course, is when a woman chooses to murder that child instead of bringing them into the world, she's essentially choosing herself, her desire to still have fun, to still go out and party. She's not ready to be a mother yet, blah, 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 all the same old excuses. To become a mother basically means you're permanently leaving childhood. And so in the interest of making her childhood eternal, she literally consumes this child. She consumes their potential childhood to continue to have her own childhood that never ends. And then they simply label this a choice, but it's not a choice. In reality, it is just spitting in the face of the necessity of sacrifice. She's essentially giving in to the emotionality of her fear or just her brash, brazen selfishness. And it comes at the expense of an entire other life. To sacrifice an unborn child for the sake of convenience or money or whatever is the highest evil possible. I'd say that is the highest evil that can be found out there today is abortion. Number 2 is easily divorce. Again, it also has to do with kids. As I said in the last video, every tenet of progressivism is bad for children. Obviously, abortion is bad for children. And then enter divorce. Marriage is difficult, of course, takes a lot of work. And some people get lazy. And then that's the point of the vow, to challenge each other to do better, that the husband and wife can overcome, the slings and arrows, the ups and downs. But now it's, well, I'm not happy. And so they sacrifice the whole family. And most of the time it's a woman doing this. So let's say that she decides she's going to get a divorce. She sacrifices the whole family for her happiness, even though happiness is never permanent and it's fleeting. And then most of them end up being much worse off in the end anyway, versus making the sacrifice of keeping together with her husband for the sake of the kids. So obviously that's on the good, and the evil would be sacrificing. She sacrifices her whole family for herself. So again, to repeat, good is sacrificing animal urges for the collective. Evil is sacrificing the collective to capitalize on animal urges. Again, you have to understand that man is an animal in order to even put that into context in the first place. Again, these evangelicals drove me insane. So all in all, that is the nature of sacrifice. Sacrifice is necessary to keep all of this going. Because if people just fall down one by one to just capitalizing on their individuality and their individual indulgences and all that, then it's literally a cancer within society. There's no better parallel to draw than if in my body, all of a sudden, each individual cell decided that they were more important than the body. That's literally what cancer is. And it grows, it grows. It doesn't stay isolated. Cancer always grows until it's cut out. It's always growing. And then that's what happens is some people give in to these temptations. Other people see it and they go, well, wait a second, they're not being punished. The hand of God isn't coming down and striking them dead, because that's what I was always told in church, because church treated them like an idiot. Instead of telling them that they are animals and that they need to have a certain amount of self-control. Instead, their children are told, if you do these things, you're going to go to hell. And they don't even know what that means. And so eventually somebody somebody in their class smokes pot. And then they go, well, wait a second, nothing happened to them, because they've been told their whole life that the hand of God would come down and strike them with lightning. And when that doesn't happen, they go, oh, turns out God's not real, so we can do whatever we want. And then 10, 15, 20 years later, they've been a pothead and wasted their life. They were scared into not doing the drug or whatever activity, but it wasn't explained to them the long-term consequences. It was just, don't do it because, God will hate you. And then they go, well, God must not be real because I did the thing and I wasn't punished. And then it's not until decades later they're punished. These are the things that people don't think about until it's too late. Okay, so I asked a bunch of guys from the Ranked Discord. Again, Ranked is my other show. If you're watching this, you're probably coming from that. But Unknown Cake Lover, a regular on Ranked, and a name I've always loved. He said, you mentioned as an example that you think it's bad to be fat. I said that in the last video. I agree, but I disagree with your reason. I don't think the main problem with being fat is that it's a problem for others, though it certainly can be. Instead, I fundamentally disagree with the premise that people make optimal decisions for themselves. I don't think being fat is just an alternative lifestyle. I think it's liable to immiserate you. I think you agree with me more than you disagree. I never said the main problem with being fat is that it's a problem for others. That's clearly not the only problem. I mean, when putting your shoes on becomes a chore, it's definitely not good for the individual, and it's also not good for, everybody else. What I'd said was that a certain friend of a friend, a stern individualist liberal, told me he believes being fat could never be immoral because it's that person's choice. Everything in today's liberalism is about choice and consent. They hyper fixate on individual choices is holy, and you have no accountability to the rest of society. That was, again, all rights with no responsibility. That's what I was arguing. I wasn't saying that being fat isn't miserable for the person. I mean, I can't imagine go watch My 600-Pound Life or whatever. Can you imagine the terror of being stuck in that body? I can't imagine a worse fate. But there are people who stand up for those people and say, well, that's their choice, with no regard for everybody else in society literally pulling their weight. That's the problem. But this brings us back to the concept of sacrifice. The gluttony of fat people and all the other 7 deadly sins, like I said, are nothing more than animal appetites. So, there's something we can't get rid of. We'll never completely be rid of those things because it's a balance. To a certain extent, we need to have hunger. Of course, our bodies need to indicate to us that we need to eat. If we turned off that instinct to eat, then obviously people would die. I mean, if we bring lust into it, we need people to have enough lust to have sex and make babies, but not so much that they're out there 24/7 trying to get it in with strangers and banging each other's wives. But of course, in a time of abundance, people take it too far. all the 7 deadly sins are the result of us being too good at our job of conquering the jungle. Because we work so hard to conquer the jungle by stifling these urges, and then things get so comfortable that we go, well, let's just let this and that slide. We got to enjoy life, right? So let's let this, that, and the other slide. The reason why religious practices began in the first place is because you can't ultimately trust people to just do a little bit. Hey, we're going to do some cocaine, but we're just going to do a little bit of cocaine, a little cocaine in moderation. I mean, we all know the adage, moderation in everything, right? But plenty of people fall through those cracks. They made an attempt at moderation and they failed miserably. And so this brings us to the concept of shame. The temptation towards self-indulgence has to be stifled on an individual basis, and that's where shame comes into play. Shame is nothing more than society's collective reaction to selfish behavior. That's all it's ever been. Patterson, an old friend of the Ranked channel, he was a cast member for the Connery episodes, the Sean Connery episodes. We had a discussion after recording one night where he brought up shame as this thing, this like weird, this horrible byproduct of society that has to be rooted out. And I said, have you ever thought about where it even came from in the first place? And I think that's a lot of people, they never think about where exactly certain concepts came from. Where did the 7 deadly sins come from? Well, obviously they came from observing the way that people took their animality way too far. So where did shame come from? Like I said, shame is society's collective reaction to selfish behavior. So I said this to Patterson. I said, don't you think that shame is in fact a good thing? That anybody pushing their animality too far, that shame reels them back in? It makes them it's a negative thing that has a positive result by pulling people back into the fold. They went too far on their rights and then they're reminded of their responsibility to others. And he said, damn, I never thought about that before. And I said, sure, fair, but how do you not think about these things? How do you not think of it? It's the classic case of the guy who comes up to a fence in the middle of the woods or in a field and he goes, why is this fence here? This is stupid. And he cuts it down and then, like the herd of buffalo get out or whatever. And it's like, oh, that's why the fence was there. Maybe before we get rid of things that we've had for thousands of years, we should consider why they came about in the first place. But again, you need to understand man as an animal in order to do that. And even certain Christians fail to realize that we're animals. You have to know that. You have to accept your animality and then understand that because of our intellect, we're able to sacrifice our basic instincts and urges in order to all get along. It facilitates cooperation, and that's the point of religion. And so as we throw religion out the window, look at what happens to society, just more and more chaos. And yet I sit here and I say things like God, Bible, Jesus, and people go like, no, and then they go off and ruin their lives. And then what do? They claim victim status after that. It's not my fault. It's society's fault for not accepting me. Society shamed me, and so I did more of the thing that I was told not to do. And then 10, 20, 30 years later, your life is in ruins. And then you go, how did this happen? It's not my fault. No, it was your fault. You were warned about these things. So good and evil are defined by the sacrifices we make for each other. And that's why at the heart of all Christianity is the story of a guy making the ultimate sacrifice. That doesn't mean that sacrifice is always offering up your life, but it's offering up our animal indulgences for the sake of others. Again, that's why the Jesus Christ story is at the core of Christianity, because Jesus kept under control the strongest animal instinct of all, which is, of course, our survival instinct, dying willingly when he could have stopped it whenever he wanted. And then I remember people talking about the Passion of the Christ. What's the big deal? It's just this guy who gets his shit pushed in and he gets beat the fuck up and then killed. Rotten score on Rotten Tomatoes, instead of thinking about that context, of a guy who is trying to save these people. He's killed by the very people he's trying to save for speaking the truth, and then sacrifices for them regardless. So that's our charge, is to sacrifice no matter what, because that's what all of this hinges upon. And without it, it's just back to the jungle. You don't want to live in the jungle because the jungle is literally hell. Jungle, stars, we got out of hell, here's heaven, we're stuck in between. We're stuck in between making sacrifices to each other or being evil pieces of shit.